Okay, I've got Yascha Mounk now. I'm very excited to talk to you because I've been reading your book and I've been reading and following your work for years. Thank you very much for joining me on Stand Up. I can't believe we've never talked before. Thank you.
Thanks for having me on.
So, the Great Experiment sounds way too much like The Great Replacement, which it's actually the opposite of. But like, there's a lot of theory based on that as well in this, on the far right. So tell us why it's the opposite and what the Great Experiment is.
Yeah, so it has a kind of backstory. I went on an interview in Germany with a big news show there, and I used this phrase, the great experiment, in describing the transition that our society is going through from, especially in Western Europe, being quite mono-ethnic, monocultural societies, to being much more multi-ethnic, multi-religious, people from lots of different parts of the world. And what I was saying is that there's no real historical precedent for how to make that work. And so people, and I said, look, we're going through this great experiment and it might go wrong. There's all kinds of problems with that. It's actually a difficult thing to get right, but I think we're going to succeed. When I went to sleep, I flew back to the United States. I switched my phone back on after, 12 hours. And I had, it pinged and pinged and pinged and pinged and pinged. And it had gone viral on the far right in Europe. And people were precisely saying, hey, Yascha Mounk admitted that he's experimenting along with Angela Merkel on the German people. He wants to replace the population. That is obviously not what I meant. So there's two different meanings of experiment, right? One is like the chemistry teacher in ninth grade who comes in and knows exactly what he's going to do, and he puts one liquid into another, and there's a big explosion, and then he explains the chemical process, right? Another is experiment in the sense in which the founding fathers talked about a great experiment in democratic self-government at the end of the 18th century, when there wasn't a precedent for societies that do that successfully, when we didn't quite know how it was going to work, but when we figured out that's what we have to try and do. So that's what I meant, right? What I meant is that in a country like the United States, it's always been diverse, but there's always been one group that had all the power and others that were dominated and were subjugated. Now we're trying to build these deeply ethnically and religiously diverse democracies that actually treat everybody as equals. And we haven't been there before yet. We've got to figure out what the rules are. We've got to figure out how this can work. That's the sense in which I meant the great experiment.
I like the book because you're a scholar and a journalist and a great writer, but you look at history and scholarship on where the great experiment has been tried or where diverse cultures have tried to live together in some kind of harmony and maybe some democracy. And I think it's really, when you're writing this book, you must have first, let me take a look at where this has been tried, what goes right and what goes wrong. So you go into that. Give me a little bit of history that you looked into when writing this book.
Yeah, so I think a lot of people have a starting point where it should be really easy to build these diverse democracies. They say, look, how hard can it be to be tolerant? How hard can it be to, treat your neighbor decently? And then that makes me really pessimistic about the current state of society because they say, look, clearly we have injustices today. Clearly we have real problems today. And so there must be something uniquely bad about us. Why can't we figure this out? What I did in this book is to look at all the reasons why it's really hard to build diverse democracies. So one of them is just human psychology, right? It just turns out that we're pretty hardwired to favor the in-group and discriminate against the out-group, to form groups in a really easy way, according to often pretty flimsy, random criteria, and then say the people who are members of our group, them we're going to love, and the people who are not members of a group, them we're going to mistrust, them we're going to treat really badly, right? And then the other thing is that all of these different societies in history that were diverse often went wrong in really bad ways. So I talk about three different modes of failure, right? One is structured anarchy, where different groups mistrust each other so much that they never agree to build a government together. And so they're often very poor parts of the world. Somalia and Afghanistan are examples here. You can't sustain roads and hospital systems and welfare states and all of those basic things because they don't have a functioning state. The second, which is kind of solution to this, is a form of domination, where you say, look, you know what? One group is going to win power over the others, and it's going to be able to build a state, it's going to be able to build some of those services, but only because some people are excluded in an extreme way. And that, of course, has been America's mode of failure. That's been slavery and other forms of domination in American history.
So
So when we,
America is just to be clear, domination is the second form that societies fail.
yeah, and that's historically been our quote unquote solution to the problem of diversity, right? We've been a diverse society from the founding of the American Republic. But we simply allowed one group to dominate the others,
Right.
and we're still dealing with the long-term consequences of that today.
Do you think that's still happening today? Like, white supremacy or the domination by wealthy elites, if not wealthy white elites. Do you think that's still fair to say in America in 2022?
So I think it's subtle, right? So it's clearly not true in our formal laws, right? For a lot of American history, there were formal laws which said that white people would be treated differently from black people, right?
Right.
That is no longer the case, thankfully. I think we've made real progress in terms of how people relate to each other in daily life. I think we actually have a much more tolerant society. We're taking lots of active steps to overcome the legacy of domination and discrimination in the past, including forms of affirmative action and all kinds of other things that actually favor some of the historically disfavored groups. And I think all of that really matters. Now, the other thing that also exists is that there's just long-term consequences of centuries of domination. And when you look,
Right.
not actually at the state of the average African American in the country, who now is middle class, living in a relatively affluent suburb, having a white collar job. But when you look at the people who live in the most disfavored black neighborhoods, there you can really still see the legacy of those centuries of
Sure.
injustice in how those neighborhoods were structured and what opportunities people there now have.
Yeah, the divide still seems so stark in so many different ways. The third, I interrupted you, but the third way that you write diverse societies fail is fragmentation. And you say that there's examples from the beginning of the 20th century. Go ahead.
Yeah, so fragmentation is basically when you say, look, there's all of these different groups, and they're all competing to have control of the state, and that's really scary. So what if we just make the price of owning the state less big? What if we just say, you know what, we'll have a sort of small state that kind of can put certain services in place, but the most important things are actually going to depend on your group membership. So the laws governing marriage and divorce and education and all of those other kinds of things just depend on which group you are a member of. So Lebanon is the obvious example here. Now that has lots of disadvantages as well. I have two Lebanese friends who come from different groups. One of them is Maronite Christian, and one of them is a Sunni, I believe. And they tried to get married within Lebanon, and the country wouldn't recognize the marriage because there is no such thing as Lebanese marriage. There's a Shia marriage, a Sunni marriage, or Maronite Christian marriage. And there's real hopes among political scientists that that kind of system of pillarization might avoid the worst kinds of conflicts because you have less to fight over. So there's no reason to go to civil war. But the most influential book arguing this was published 3 years before a terrible, protracted civil war broke out in Lebanon. So fragmentation, I think, is also a real danger.
My people are from Lebanon, and it's was a fascinating and diverse. I mean, it's a I guess a really interesting, at least in the Middle East country, to look at to talk about diverse societies. But let me go back to where you started the book, Yascha, which is you ask and answer the question, why can't we all just get along? And you do cite some science here in terms of why we become so tribal over not just the obvious ethnicity or religion or gender, sexual orientation, but almost anything like our sports teams. Go ahead. Why can't we get along?
Well, so I think that goes back to how naturally, how deeply we end up forming groups. So I tell the story of Henry Teifel, who's a really interesting social psychologist. Most of his family is killed in the Holocaust, and he tries to figure out what is it about groups that makes people willing to harm each other in these extreme ways. And he says, look, I have a really great idea. I'm a scientist, right? So let me create a group that's so silly, that's so meaningless, that its members are not going to discriminate against outsiders. And then I can slowly add on additional features to this group until they have this kind of group level attribute of motivating discrimination. And then I'll understand what it is about groups that makes people tick that way. And so he gets these kids into the lab from the suburbs of Bristol in England, and he shows them a sheet of paper with 150 dots on it. And he says, hey, have a guess how many dots on the sheet of paper. And so some say 120 and some say 180. He says, great, I'm going to split you into underestimators and overestimators. And then I'll have you play games against each other.
Yeah.
Sort of distribution game where you have to allocate points to each other that can be redeemed for money, right? And it turns out that he failed because the underestimators immediately started discriminating against the overestimators. And the overestimators started discriminating against the underestimators. Now, by the way, I teach a bunch of undergrads who think of themselves as the most tolerant people in the world.
Yeah.
And perhaps in some ways they are. But I have them play something similar by asking them, is a hot dog a sandwich? And it turns out that the kids who think that a hot dog is a sandwich start to discriminate against those who think that a hot dog is not a sandwich, right? So our ability to form groups is just part of the basic repertoire of human psychology, and we're tempted into it in virtually any situation. And so if we're trying to figure out how do we build diverse democracies, how do we make this ethnic and religious diversity work in the United States today, one of the questions we have to answer is how do we deal with this human groupishness?
Can those experiments are repeated over and over? I mean, that's pretty conclusive that just humans behave that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, where you draw the boundary between groups and what kind of action that is going to encourage, that really depends on the circumstances, right? So I have another great study that I tell the story of in the book, which is that of two tribes in southeastern Africa, the Chawas and the Tumbukas. So this researcher goes and talks to Chawas in Malawi, and he asks them, "How do you feel about Tumbukas?" And they say, "Oh, I don't like them at all. You know, they have all the wrong dances at their weddings, and the newlywed couple has to go and live with the bride's family. That's really weird. They should obviously live with the groom's family." He says, "Okay, well, could you ever imagine marrying somebody from that group or voting for one of the political candidates?" Like, no, 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 of course not. What are you talking about? Right? So he goes to speak to the Tumbukas, and it turns out they have exactly the same prejudices in reverse, right? Oh, the marriage dances are all wrong, and they go and live with a groom's family. That's really weird. They should live with a bride's family, right? And he says, I wouldn't marry them. I wouldn't vote for a political candidate. So it's really tempting to think, this conflict between Chavez and Bucas is just a primordial hatred. They've always hated each other. They're always going to hate each other. Nothing to be done about it. But then this researcher went a few miles across the arbitrarily drawn border from Malawi to Zambia. One of those colonial borders drawn by some colonial official in the 19th century on a map. No real differences. And he talks to the Chawas there. And he says, how do you feel about Tumbuka? I said, well, they're a little different from us. The dances are different. They have different bridal customs. But you know what? I like them. I said, oh, really? You'd vote for them? You'd marry them? Yeah, sure. Why not? And the Tumbukas in Zambia, same story. They're much more tolerant towards the Chawas. Because why is this, right? Why do they hate each
Yeah.
other in
Yeah.
Malawi? Why do they like each other in Zambia? And the answer is politics in this case. So in Malawi, it's a relatively small country, and Chawas and Tumbukas together are a huge share of the population. And so they compete against each other, right?
Mm.
Most elections is a Chawa candidate against a Tumbuka candidate. They're both trying to be president, both trying to give benefits to their group. Zambia is a bigger country and a more ethnically diverse country. And so, in order to compete in politics, the eastern tribes, which include Chawas and Tumbukas, have to band together to fight against the western tribes, right? So, in that context, Chawas and Tumbukas are political allies, and they end up having these much more positive views about each other.
I mean, then you can replay that in societies throughout human civilization, including the U.S. or Canada or anywhere else, because it comes down to politics. You're saying,
Yeah. So, look, in American history, you go back 100 years and look at the history of certain cities. The conflict between Irish and Italians was
yeah,
really strong. They're politically in competition. They hate each other. They had rival gangs or beat each other up, right? And today, there's not a salient difference. In fact, we think of them as just part of the same voting bloc of whites, right? And so
yeah.
now our story is, the next 100 years of American politics is going to be this competition between these two blocks of whites on the one side and people of color on the other side. That's a really powerful narrative in American politics right now. A lot of Republicans believe in that, and they're afraid of it because the portion of the white population is declining, and the portion of people of color is increasing, and so they think, hey, this is going to screw our country, and it's going to screw, our party. We're not going to have a chance to win. And a lot of Democrats also believe that, and they're triumphalist about it, right? They're like, we're always going to win. Well, it doesn't work like that. And you saw that in the 2020 election. The only reason why Donald Trump nearly won in 2020 is that he hugely increased the share of the vote among African Americans, among Asian Americans, and particularly among Latinos. And the only reason why Joe Biden is the legitimately elected 46th president of the United States is that he significantly increased his share of the vote among the white population.
Right.
And so I really hate this idea that demography is destiny. I really hate this idea that American society is a sort of easy split between whites and people of color, because that's a future that we should fear rather than one that we should cheer on. And it is a future which, thankfully, doesn't at this point describe what the reality actually is.
Yeah, I've made the demographics are destiny argument a couple of times and had it blow up in my face within like 4 weeks. Melania Trump Melania Trump will never ever be the first lady. I assured people who listened to me, Yascha, not that I was a guy who has ever presented himself as an authority on anything at all. I just like to think I ask smart people like you good questions. But like the point was, I only was making that argument because of the Hispanic vote. There was just no way that there were enough people, enough Hispanic American voters they would, and that was the conventional wisdom at the time. That was
Yeah,
why.
those articles in NPR and the New York Times and Vox saying exactly that, like no way Trump can win. It's just a game of demography. But that shows how we stereotype voters, right?
Sure.
There's a poll showing a majority of people favoring building a wall on the southern border. Who was that poll off, you think?
They're favoring. I would think it would be white people that majority favored the walls. That you're saying white men?
No, it was Mexicans, and it wasn't Mexican Americans. It was Mexicans in Mexico
Yeah.
favoring the construction of a border on the southern border of Mexico, right? So there's all kinds of tensions
Right.
within
Right.
Latin America between people who hail from different countries, between different ethnic groups, between Latinos who consider themselves, Latin Americans who consider themselves white, and those who are native, right? And so the idea that Mexican Americans would naturally be revolted by Trump's deeply unpleasant, deeply revolting rhetoric uh, about Central Americans, for example, just relies on this naive idea that this group that we call Latino is homogeneous, that they share everything, that they don't have different interests, they don't have different cultures, they don't have different histories. It's one of the ways in which this distinction between this division to 4 or 5 easy demographic categories, and even more so the broad distinction between whites and people of color, just makes a caricature of a much more complicated reality on the ground.
One of the ways that you argue for how diverse democracies can succeed is to embrace patriotism, which of course makes people like me uneasy because of what that creates in my mind. However, as I'm reading the book, you're arguing more for, having some kind of I think a unifying experience. And I've always thought a national service that didn't include or insist or require military service, some kind of other national service like the Peace Corps, AmeriCorps, or what was included in one of these bills, the civilian Green Corps, whatever it was, to create renewable stuff, jobs. What is this patriotism that you argue for? Why do we need it? How can we have it with such divides in this country?
Hmm. Look, one of my heroes is George Orwell, who not only is a wonderful writer, but also a very courageous man. He went to fight for the Spanish Republic against the fascists in the 30s and risked his life for it, may have paid with his life, and maybe that he died of some of the after effects of the injuries he sustained there. So he is, politically unimpeachable. But he did a weird thing in the middle of World War II, which was to sit down to write an essay praising patriotism. Now, that might seem weird in the middle of World War II, right? What he was saying is that if the British intelligentsia had convinced us to shed our patriotism in the years leading up to World War II, the men of the SS would now be patrolling the streets of London. While the patriotism is one of the things that allowed Britain to resist the Nazis and to withstand the Blitz. And I think today, when you look at Ukraine, you see the relevance of that to this moment. The millions of people in Ukraine who are voluntarily risking their lives to defend the country against this terrible invasion by Vladimir Putin. Now, the question then becomes, what kind of patriotism do we want? Because there's
Right.
obviously terrible forms of it. Vladimir Putin claims to be a patriot as well. Donald Trump claims to be a patriot, right? Um, I think there's sort of three different notions of patriotism that have historically been there, or two of them, and I'm adding one. So one is an ethnic nationalism, right? One is to say what it is to be a true Italian, a true Frenchman, true German is you have grandparents who were here and great grandparents who were here and great great grandparents who were here, and you got to descend from the same folk. Well, that obviously is something that I strongly disagree with. I don't see the moral significance in that kind of ethnic kinship. And it's not how most people in these societies today think
Right.
about the nation, right? Most Americans recognize that there's true Americans who come from all over the world, right? So let's reject that. The second, which is the traditional answer that people give, is a kind of civic or constitutional patriotism, right? What is it to love America? It's to love the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights. And that speaks to me. I became a United States citizen 5 years ago, and I was proud, especially in the spring of 2017, to swear to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. That is meaningful to me. And it's the reason, by the way, why the brave Russians who are protesting the war outside the Kremlin aren't traitors to their country. They're true patriots because they're saying, not in the name of my nation, not in the name of its rightful values, right? So we need civic patriotism. But civic patriotism is not enough. Why? Because most people just don't care that much about politics. When you
Right.
ask most people, why do you love America? They're not going to tell you about the Declaration of Independence, and they don't know what's in the Eighth Amendment, right? So what motivates that everyday love of a country that you actually get when you talk to people? And that can often be very healthy. That can motivate us to have solidarity with each other. That can motivate us to care about people who might not have the same color of skin, who might have a different religion, who might live very far away from us. But I think there's a love of a culture. It's a love of the cities and the landscapes, of the sights and sounds and smells of a country, of the cultural scripts, the way we engage with each other, of the celebrities, of the TikTok stars, the silly stuff too. And that's actually a dynamic, an inclusive, and naturally diverse culture. It's one that's looking more towards the future than towards the past. And I think we should recognize that that's what makes most people love the countries in which they're raised, and that can be a positive thing.
Well, I mean, but it's one thing to create some kind of unification or patriotism through an event like a war, which we don't want. So it leads me to another part of the book, which is where you talk about the role that the state, that government can play in creating successful, diverse democracies. And I think that that's, ties into what you're talking about patriotism. What role can the state play to create that?
So I don't think that this is so much about the state, right? So in general, I thought a lot about what I call the chapter 10 problem in this book. So I'm sure that a lot of your guests who are talking about books, they have this deep analysis of some set of problems in the world, and they explain that in 9 chapters of their book. And then they have a problem of what on earth do I say in the chapter 10 where I'm supposed to be constructive, right? And so they're going to say, either here's this like incredibly ambitious solution to all these problems. You're listening to it and you think, I know we're never going to take this solution. Perhaps it would be great if we did. We're just not gonna. I know what Congress looks like. It's not going to happen, right?
Right.
Or they have like a couple of small fixes. We're like, yeah, perhaps we can pass those, but they're not. We can talk about this huge problem. This is not going to solve that huge problem, right? So, so how do I solve the chapter 10 problem? I basically think that the best our politics can do is to not screw things up even more. When I look
Yeah.
at the political level right now, I'm really depressed. But I think that the changes in the heart of society are actually really positive. I think this country is much more tolerant than it was 50 or 25 years ago. I think there's actually much more people engaging with each other across ethnic and religious boundaries. We actually have very rapid social and economic and educational progress for the descendants of immigrants. We actually have a smaller wage gap than we used to between different demographic groups. So, what politics needs to do is to encourage those positive trends and to make sure that we don't screw them up by introducing negative ones.
Final question for you is just, and if you write about it, I haven't gotten into it, but you talk about what politics can do, what the state can do, what we can do as individuals. But I always get wrapped up, Yascha, on what media does do. So I feel like, especially on the right, that the politicians follow the media. So Tucker Carlson has this beef or this, he wants to create this thing. And the next thing you know, Trump is saying it and Matt Gaetz is tweeting it, and it starts there. I'm not saying that doesn't happen on the left too, but it really does dominate on the right. And I just wonder what role media you think, if that is going to change, or how influential you think media is in general.
So I think media is really influential, and I despair about the fact that media has really just become tribalist, right? It's just become a matter of affirming the pre-existing values and beliefs of your own side. And I think the difference between the letter to the editor and Twitter is really important here, right? 30 years ago, journalists knew that most readers don't have the energy to comment about everything that they publish. And so the letters of the editor to the editor you got, people would take seriously and would sometimes print them in the newspaper. They also knew these were outlier reactions. That wasn't what the average reader thinks, right? Now they look at Twitter and they think that what they see on Twitter is actually representative of what most of their readers think. And every time that they somehow go against the sort of biases that each side has, the reaction on Twitter is really, really damning. And so we say, let's not do that, right? Let's not upset our readers. Let's not tell them inconvenient facts.
Right.
And so that leads to a discourse in which, more and more cable news is no better than just Twitter gladiators.
Right. Yeah.
And frankly, some of the mainstream newspapers aren't that much better anymore either. And so that really worries me because it appeals to the worst angels in our nature. Now, the problem is that some of that is also responding to demand from most politically activated people, right? We have a society, one way that I think about America right now, so we have a kind of civil war of the cultural elites and the most politically engaged people in the country.
Yeah.
The people who really care about politics and really, really think about politics, a lot of the most highly educated people in the country, they really hate each other, and they're often deeply unreasonable. And the more you go out and you talk to ordinary people, the more they actually are sensible and decent. And so one of the questions is, is this civil war of the most politically engaged going to be imposed on the rest of society, or can the rest of us actually defend ourselves against that?
Well, I will tell you at the next Board of Education meeting, because that's where it's happening in my town. It's wild.
Wow.
Yascha,
You'll have to tell me about that over a drink sometime.
Oh, anytime. I look forward to that. I really appreciate you joining me, and I hope everybody gets the book. And I hope to talk to you again soon. I really challenged a lot of my thinking and made me think deeper on so many things. It's really great read and super important and timely. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pete.